This meeting is being recorded.
So Lama Adam, we're welcoming you to our center virtually, Santa Monica KTC. We're really so honored to have you join us tonight. I know I've been watching and listening to you since you got out of retreat, and I think it's really nice to hear such like a fresh, young voice in the Dharma. And I know you're really stoked and excited, and it comes across in how you teach. So we're really happy you're with us tonight. So I'll just hand it over to you, and everyone will mute. And then if you have, if you'd like to have some time for questions and answers, you can just let us know, but we're going to just hand it over to you and turn the wheel of the Dharma for us.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. And I know there's a lot of really experienced practitioners here, much longer practitioners than I've been doing this. So thank you all for your practice and your devotion and all those things. And as I think Lama Kathy said many times, like the Dharma is a big deal. And like, I just feel lucky to be able to have been close to these teachings, as I know all you guys have, and to be, particularly to be in the presence of great masters like Kempa Rinpoche and the Karmapas. And so we're just really so fortunate. And so in Columbus, we usually start with the 4-line refuge prayer. So if everyone will do, let's do twice in Tibetan, and then we'll do the middle one in English. O Sangye Chidan Soki Chodnama Janchu Padu Dadni Kyapsuchi Dagi Jinso Kipe Sunamki Drola Penchi Sangye Drupasho. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha until I reach enlightenment. By the merit of accomplishing the 6 perfections, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. Sangye Chidan Soki Chodnama Janchu Padu Dagni Kyapsuchi Dagi Jinso Kipe Sunapki Drola Pinchi Sangye Drupasho. Aden Sawe Lama Rinpoche Daki Chiwa Pedite Jula Kadrin Javogo Neje Zunze Kusum Toki Gyudrupsa Duso. All right. I'm just so excited. So I wanted to think of something that we could do in like little installments, like that had a common thread. And so the title of this series was Meeting Our Interdependence with Compassion. But the subject matter is going to be the 3 marks of existence. So the idea here is that these 3 marks that we'll discuss, impermanence, discontentment, and insubstantiality, are all like aspects or manifestations of interdependence. And this is such an important topic because Kempa Rinpoche has said that our main issue is that we're not recognizing the actual mode of reality or the way things are. And liberation can be attained just through realizing that. So we have all these methods, and we have all these deities, and we have all these things that we can do that help us to get there. But at the end of the day, it's just recognizing the way stuff really is that gets us there. And I this past year, I think I may have mentioned this in one of my last talks at KTC, but I made a conscious decision after like my first year out and kind of flailing with all kinds of different teachings that I was going to do like a Hinayana year. And so that's kind of what I've been doing is kind of keeping things as close to the foundational vehicle as possible. And then at some point soon here, I'll kind of turn the corner into Mahayana stuff. And the idea being that I really wanted to feel like I had enough time to dive into this stuff exclusively, like Hinayana type teachings, and also to be able to develop some sort of pocket definitions and analogies and things like that, because that's one of Lama Kathy's great things that I admire very much. Is she's just got great little things to just pull out to describe anything. So I felt like I needed to kind of build my repertoire. And so that's why we're talking about the 3 marks rather than the 4 seals. So the 4 seals has the addition of nirvana is peace to those other 3. And that was from what I understand, that was a Mahayana development that came a little bit later. But those 3 marks of existence. So the key here is that the 3 marks describe kind of like the wrong way of viewing it. So, sorry, I got to pull up my notes now. So we tend to think, that we are permanent. We may not, I mean, we say that we know we're going to die, but moment to moment, we kind of forget that. And we are shocked when things change and don't go our way. So we're clearly not fully understanding our impermanence. Similarly, we think that there's a way that we can fix our external circumstances so everything's great. We're constantly trying to kind of hack samsara, and that is our source of our discontentment. And similarly, we think that we're a kind of like we are a thing rather than we are a process. We don't recognize our own insubstantiality, so we develop an illusion of permanence to this kind, or of substantiality, like a realness to the idea of a self. So to counteract those things, we talk about the three marks. And today we're going to talk about impermanence in particular. And I think it's worth starting just with a recap of the 4 noble truths and the idea that discontentment, dissatisfaction, what we sometimes call suffering, is a mark of our existence, and it kind of runs through everything, even the good and the bad. And then the good news, though, about that is that there's a cause for that. And the Buddha said that cause is attachment. So attachment is what is to be abandoned, because if we can abandon the attachment, we can achieve the cessation of suffering. And there is a path to do that. So that's a really good grounding to start with, because in particular, having an understanding of attachment and an understanding of suffering, but the willingness and the desire to abandon the attachment is what underpins all of this. So with that foundational teaching, we also have the foundational meditation of Shamatha. And Shamatha is a practice of cultivating mindfulness and awareness. We have this mindfulness aspect that's like precise, what we're doing and what we're trying to do in the moment. In a practice of Shamatha, we're placing the attention on the breath. And with our awareness, we notice when we become distracted. And when we notice that, we bring our attention back to the breath. And the idea here is to try to begin to cultivate some ability to be present with our experience without latching onto it and without pushing it away. So even in the practice of Shamatha, we can begin to cultivate a fertile ground for compassion by just being gentle with ourselves. And our Shamatha is a good practice ground because it really is working with our entire experience. When we, in that moment of noticing a distraction and coming back, we are working with kind of the atoms of, or the subatomic particles of our whole stream of experience, because that moment is happening all day long, all the time. The thoughts are arising, we're noticing them or not. And when we notice them, we're hopefully coming back to the breath or coming back to whatever our purpose is in the moment. But the key that I want to highlight is how we're coming back, because one thing I've definitely noticed in this last couple of years is how much of a hurdle it is for people to understand that the noticing of a distraction, or the noticing of diverging from our goals or diverging from what we're trying to do, is actually not a problem. You know, the noticing is a wonderful thing. It's a gift. And it's actually part of what we're trying to cultivate. You know, we're cultivating mindfulness, and we're also cultivating this awareness. So when we notice a mistake, that awareness, that is awareness happening. That is a development of that quality of awareness. And Pema Chodron has said that harshness is an obstacle to meditation, and criticalness is an obstacle to enlightenment. And so these are things that we need to remember, that like when we come back from a distraction, even just in shamatha, that is a time to cultivate our compassion with ourselves in the situation, and just do it gently, do it friendly, in a friendly manner. So that's why she always says, just come back gently. And so that's a technique that I think will run through what we're talking about today. But I want to start with talking about shamatha, just because that those building blocks are really what we're talking about, like noticing a thing and coming back gently. So we repeatedly make this mistake, right? We make these mistakes about impermanence. We make these mistakes about discontentment. We make these mistakes about insubstantiality. So the biggest example, since we're talking about impermanence today, the biggest example of impermanence for everyone, of course, is death, birth and death. In particular, when we die or people we know die. It's one of the most painful situations. We need to be thinking now about people in Ukraine right now, because that's obviously a very volatile and unfortunate situation where people are no doubt dying right now. So obviously our thoughts go out to them, but this impermanence of things like war and death, these are all examples of gross impermanence, an impermanence that kind of seems to happen like that and everything changes. So there are another examples would be just like any beginnings and endings, you know, leaving a job, starting a job. All of these are gross forms of impermanence. They're big, they're obvious. They usually are, they can be traumatic for us. They can rock our whole situation. And another analogy for this, I think, is meditation and post-meditation. Like we kind of think that we're on the cushion and then we get off the cushion. And that's like a big change. And so I think it's important to think about this stuff, because there's also subtle impermanence. And so the scale between gross and subtle, I want to make the point here that that's relative, you know. So any change or decay would be like a subtle impermanence, like we're all getting older all the time. Things are regularly changing and decaying. Things that come together come apart, but it may happen very slowly. You know, I have like on this table here, there's like a little strip of plastic that's been slowly peeling away from the table over time, and that's a sign of subtle impermanence. But time itself is subtle impermanence. But we make these distinctions, but they're really all relative. I mean, we're just talking about impermanence here. And I think that's an important point. So recognizing these gross impermanences and these subtle impermanences is a relative endeavor. And so a good example would be like, I was reading today, Zonsar Khyentse Rinpoche's What Makes You Not a Buddhist? And he had a really great example about impermanence, where he talked about an egg and cooking an egg. And this was both an example of interdependence and an example of impermanence. So he used this example by way of saying, you know, like when we go to cook an egg, there's so many interdependent factors that lead to that. So we need to have a pan, we need to have a stove, we need to have the egg. All of these things go into cooking an egg. So that's sort of a sign of interdependence. And then having that pan has its own set of causes and conditions. We had to have gone out and bought it. We had to have the money to buy it. We had to have the store to buy it from. And that's just one piece of this sort of web of interdependence of cooking an egg. But then there's also before we cook the egg, and then once the egg's finally cooked, that would be sort of a gross form of impermanence. But all along the way in between there's a subtle impermanence taking place. And so I thought that was a really good analogy. I usually hear the seed, but I like the egg analogy. And So the first way I want to talk about working with impermanence is renunciation. So in a way, this is going to be like a 3-vehicle approach to impermanence. So for instance, depending on the circumstances of our material world, we know can be futile. I mean, we know this and we say this and we get the concept, but things are always changing. And as long as we're looking outside and trying to rearrange our external environment, to rearrange samsara, it's not going to be a very dependable source of our lasting happiness. And that's really what we're going for with all Buddhist practice, is trying to find a true lasting happiness. So, so we keep thinking, though, that we can go out there and move the deck chairs around and get it just right. So one of the ways to approach impermanence is to start to cultivate some sense of renunciation for worldly things. And that doesn't mean non-engagement. That doesn't mean not doing things anymore, and doesn't mean not doing things that bring us comfort, or not going out and meeting friends. We need to do those things to a certain degree too, but we need to start to develop a little bit of renunciation. And so that's one sort of Hinayana approach towards impermanence. And what did I say? So for instance, our Buddha nature that is inherent within all of us is itself, that is a stable source. So when we go for refuge, one of the reasons for that is because that potential, that inherent Buddha nature, is itself a stable source. So our external environment demonstrates no real characteristics of any kind of permanence, but our Buddha nature is dependable, and that's something we can work with. And so if we can start to turn our attention inward, then that begins the process of finding a stable source of happiness, rather than outwards, where things are constantly changing in gross and subtle ways. And so we also need to think here about balance. So when I said it doesn't mean do not engage, it means we need to start to develop some kind of awareness so that we know, number one, what we're doing. Like, are we seeking some sort of comfort in the external world? Not that we can't do that, but we should know that we're doing that. And then also, like, making some decisions about when maybe we don't want to go for comfort. Maybe we want to actually practice a little bit with our situation. And so that means sometimes sitting with a little bit of discomfort. And that's where renunciation can be a useful practice. Is we don't necessarily have to totally give up things or not engage with samsaric things, but we can interrupt the habit of grasping at the external world just in taking a few moments to not do what we might normally do for happiness in the external world. So for instance, if we my favorite example is like the cell phone, like just reaching for the cell phone because you feel like reaching for the cell phone. That is absolutely a moment of discontentment, a moment of dukkha, suffering. So that doesn't mean don't ever touch your phone, but you can take just a couple moments to start to establish a habit of being with that feeling, the energy of that feeling. Things that we call emotions that we think that we have to react to are all really just energy in their core. And what we do with that energy frequently is pile a story on top of it. So if we can just sit with a feeling, sit with that energy, even just briefly, that actually increases our ability to be comfortable in more circumstances. And it's funny because it doesn't take a lot, right? I mean, we kind of know this. A good example of why we can believe that is because I think everyone here knows how much of your day you meditate versus how much benefit you get for the whole rest of the day. I mean, it's small investments can have big returns. And it's the same thing in these moments in everyday life when we feel some discomfort. we can actually practice with any moment of discomfort with just a few moments of just being with it without telling a story, without grasping onto it, and without pushing it away. So those are kind of the two extremes we can go to. We can pull it in and try to hang on to it, solidify it, or we can push it away and ignore it, try to not see it. So so renunciation in a lot of ways means, rather than reaching out for something, just be, just sort of be with whatever that energy is. And another way to approach it would be with some kind of compassion. So for instance, thinking of feelings of loss and pain and sickness and things like that, we could start to recognize that those experiences are not unique to us. And in fact, while those situations of particularly like death and things like that, they feel deeply personal. And I know from experience too, it can feel really strange to like go out in the world when you've lost somebody and like no one else is feeling that, it's kind of just you. But we all will meet with that. And everybody we see, whether they're celebrating a new job, when you just lost your grandmother or whatever, like we've all encountered these things, and we all will encounter these things. And so it's at once deeply personal and completely universal. And so there's really something special about tapping in to that. And there's a similar thing we can do in terms of just being with those feelings sometimes. Loss is particularly hard, but it also is just sort of an energy in its core. And so sometimes it's nice to just kind of try to just be with those feelings without telling stories, because particularly if we're talking about death, those stories a lot of times turn to, why is this happening to me? Or why is this happening to that person? And we get into, we just start to pile concepts onto the situation. And what that actually does is prevent us from connecting with what's actually a manifestation of our enlightened mind. And we really, that's one of the reasons why we need to connect with these sensations directly, without, and when I say directly, I mean without stories and concepts and self and other, just kind of having a felt experience of these situations before we jump to some kind of story. And this is really, it's an easy practice to describe, just be with the feeling. But it's incredibly profound and difficult, and actually gets right at the heart of some of the most profound tantric teachings. This is kind of the essence of a lot of those, really. It's just being able to interact with the energy of emotion without grasping on to stories or pushing them away. So there's a great analogy that Trungpa Rinpoche gave about how emotion is like water, and then when we mix it with our thoughts and our stories, it's like putting a pigment in there. So all of a sudden, that what was fluid and clear becomes brightly colored and opaque. And that's really what happens with our emotions when we start to engage in storytelling and blame and just kind of indulging the idea of a self, really. So that's a good practice in general. And in terms of approaching impermanence with compassion, we can think of this in terms of having sympathy and empathy for others who have loss as well. But this is also compassionate towards ourselves when we can actually take a moment to do what will really help, And what will really help is not being attached to a preferred outcome, and instead just being with that natural dynamic flow of that energy. So that, again, compassion comes up here in a really just in our own realm. Like we can have compassion for others, but just like when we come back in shamatha in a gentle way, that's like the seed of compassion that's going to radiate out to everybody else too. So that's an important point. And like a third way we can approach impermanence would be to take a sort of panoramic view. And that would be zooming out and recognizing that these beginnings and endings that we see that are so dramatic are actually happening all the time. And that's one of the reasons why we work so much with thinking about death in Buddhism, is that the more we can familiarize ourselves with beginnings and endings in that gross way, the easier it becomes to relate to beginnings and endings in the course of a single day. And so it's difficult to cultivate that view, that panoramic idea that these changes are happening all the time. But things don't last forever. And that also means things that we perceive as negative. So that's another way to kind of approach this panoramic view, is remembering that even these negative things won't last. And a good example of that is a really bad mood. You know, I can remember in particular a day in retreat where I was, it was just a really hard day and I was crying in my room and it was really bad. And, you know, there was never a point in retreat where I ever thought of leaving, but it was a really bad day. And then I remember like 2 or 3 hours later being back in my room and I was so happy, like, because impermanence, you know, and in the moment, like that's another, you know, thinking about suffering and discontentment, you know, a lot of what happens is we pile on our discontentment about being discontented, you know, which is really unfortunate for all of us, but we feel bad because we're in a bad mood, you know, and then that makes a string of memories. I remember realizing this long before I was even Buddhist, just this idea that like every moment of feeling bad or feeling bad about feeling bad becomes a memory, you know, and then that becomes like our string of existence, you know. So just being able in a moment of anger or a moment of loneliness, you know, to recognize that that situation is going to change. Can be really powerful. And actually, if you can remember that it's going to change, that's usually a good moment to engage with that energy again, you know, because you kind of zoomed out a little bit, recognized, oh, this is not going to last forever. So let me engage with this energy for a moment. You know, let me do something productive for myself and for all beings and be present with this. So this is about, in this panoramic view, this is about recognizing impermanence as a chance for like new beginnings. And always abilities to reinvent. We know things will change. If they change for the worse, at some point they're going to change for the better. And then maybe a fourth way to think about this is thinking of impermanence as like a symbol of reality itself. And what I mean by that is continuity, you know, like the truth from its own side is not changing. So that's an important thing to remember. Our true nature is described as being open and clear. And a comparison with that is often like emptiness and compassion, or limitlessness and skillful means. You know, so we have these two aspects that we're working with all the time. And that's one of the reasons why, for instance, we practice Shamatha and Tonglen, because we have this wisdom access aspect that we're working with. We're working on cultivating openness. And at the same time, we work with Tonglen because that's the practical, skillful means that we're going to apply. And those two things are necessary in conjunction with each other. And so knowing how things really are, we can start to begin to decide how we want to roll with those things. Because again, our experience is a process and we need to tune into that. And that's one of the reasons why awareness becomes so important, and not turning away from this dynamic flow of energy, like actually becoming familiar with it, getting to know it better. Because these, to go back to what I said about gross and subtle impermanence being relative, we frequently don't notice the subtle impermanence, but the gross impermanence racks us to our core. You know, these are the things that shock us and cause us to spiral out. For me, it's like, that's what'll mess with my practice. I mean, not everybody's like that. I know people who, when they're having a hard time, then they practice, but when things are easy, then they don't even think about it. It's kind of the opposite for me. So can kind of go either way. But it's interesting because we're always trying to find some kind of balance. And in a session of meditation, even so, meditation is a great metaphor for our whole experience. We could think of our meditation as a thing, like we sit down and we do this thing and it should look like this every time. And if it doesn't look like that, something's wrong. I'm not doing good enough. My teacher didn't teach me right. Any number of things could come up when we think of it as a thing. But our meditation is a process, just like our whole experience. And what that really means is that it's a series of small adjustments. That's what a session of meditation is. That may be, the most obvious thing is between like tight and loose. And we know even with the physical aspects of a session of meditation, you sit down and sometimes you notice you're starting to slouch a little bit. So you sit back up, and we're constantly adjusting in a session of meditation. And that's how it should look. It's a process. And so maybe in the beginning, the best thing to do is to start with a little bit on the tightness side, because we try to get everything right with our posture and get everything right with the technique right at the beginning. But then we kind of launch into the process of meditation. And that process is itself an alternation of periods of attention and periods of mental wandering. And that's what it's going to be. Every day is going to be a little different, but it's going to be that movement between attention and wandering. And it's also going to be a movement between agitation and dullness. So we're always trying to kind of find a balance between those things. When we notice that we're a little bit agitated, we maybe lower our gaze a little bit or engage in any maybe visualizations we've learned about calming the agitation. If we're a little bit dull, we maybe raise our gaze a little bit or engage in any kind of visualizations we've learned to adjust that. But we're applying these little antidotes all the time to try to maintain a balance. And I've been loving thinking about like the idea of like a plate on a stick lately, as opposed to like a seesaw, because it's not just like between agitation and dullness, and it's not just between tightness and looseness. There's all kinds of stuff, happy, sad, liking, not liking, like we're always kind of moving between all kinds of extremes, false and true. So thinking of it as a plate, I like, because it's not just one direction or the other. We're always adjusting one way or the other. And that is a session of meditation. And that, to relate back to what we said in the beginning, a lot of that is noticing that we're not quite where we want to be. And we need to make a small adjustment to get back. But cultivating the compassion there helps a lot, because we need to make these good habits. And part of those good habits are tuning in to when we're not quite where we want to be, not turning away from those moments when we recognize we're not quite where we want to be. And part of the reason that's so important is because thinking in terms of gross and subtle, why is it that we only recognize the gross impermanence and it hits us so hard? And we have to do all these things to adjust to that gross impermanence. If you think of that plate again, it's like every time it tips, we wait till it gets way over here to push it back, and then if you try to push something back from a dramatic, divergence, it's hard to get it right back to the middle. It's way off, and we may flip it the other direction. And this is really disturbing to us. It's disturbing to the mind. It's disheartening. So it doesn't need to be, but that's how we take it. So I want to make this point that, like, if we can tune in to the subtle changes, to those subtle moments, first of all, we're going to catch them more often. So that's an important thing to know first. It's not going to be like the more we increase our awareness, the less we're going to notice change. In fact, we're going to notice it a whole lot more. And we're going to notice all these divergences from our technique a whole lot more. That's part of this process. And we're going to need to adjust a whole lot more, because we're responding to much more subtle shifts in that balance. And if we can do that, there's less dramatic shifts that happen. So there's less kind of surprises and less shock. And it's a more constant activity, that kind of awareness. It's a more, so rather than assuming it's a thing or assuming our meditation is a certain way, and when it's not, heaving it back into position, we can moment to moment, literally, make these adjustments. And then the activity becomes a process. Then our meditation becomes a consistent flow, a dynamic flow between all these different qualities. And I want to make the analogy here too, that I believe this is like what we're heading towards when we talk about Buddha activity, enlightened activity, because enlightened activity is described as being like spontaneous in response to the circumstances in a situation. It just happens. And it's been said, that Buddhas don't just reach enlightenment and then, rest in meditative equipoise forever. Like there's work to be done. And that work is this enlightened activity. And so there is a great amount of activity that comes with enlightenment from what we've been told. It makes sense. I can't tell you from my own perspective, but it makes total sense that how else would the Karmapa be benefiting beings in billions of worlds if he's only every once in a while reaching over here to fix something? So there's a great amount of activity that's necessary. And so similarly in our own practice, the more that we can be making these little adjustments on the subtle level, the smoother things become, and the more tuned in we become, and the more spontaneous we become. Because why aren't we making these subtle adjustments? Part of the reason is because we don't want to look at where things are going wrong. It's worth noting, I'll have to, maybe you guys can tell me later on what you think about this, but it took me a long time to realize that the root of ignorance is ignore. I just thought that meant like you didn't know. But it took me until we were in retreat and Tugu Damchu Rinpoche gave us a teaching, and I think it blew all of our minds, this idea that there's like a volitional aspect to ignorance, and so that's why when we talk about compassion and, particularly like being gentle in our meditation practice and in our practice in daily life, I think that's one of the reasons that's so important, because we have a habit of hating seeing our mistakes and hating seeing when we're not, doing what we set out to do in a way that, to some sort of standard of perfection, that we'll never really meet. So recognizing that there's a process here, that we can be compassionate, and that we should be adjusting more and more and more often as our practice develops, but in more subtle ways, can be a really powerful thing, because that's how we get towards this openness aspect, like recognizing this aspect of limitlessness. And limitlessness rejects nothing, right? So that's like an awareness aspect. And then there's also this aspect of lucidity or clarity, the precision aspect of that nature. And that precision aspect is doing something, and we can be using it to do productive activity, like to sort of, I don't want to say mimic, but model enlightened activity, even at our own stage now. We can begin to sort of engender that activity. And that's what helps us start to recognize that nature, that openness and that clarity, is being open to our whole experience, not turning away from it, not ignoring it, and also engaging fully in doing the things that are necessary according to the situation as it is, not how we think it is or how we want it to be or how it is compared to another time. One more analogy I wanted to share, because I was talking to Lama Mitchell in Mississippi about this today, and I was thinking about it's kind of funny that we can drive at all, considering how our meditation practice goes. Because if you're on a freeway, right, you've got like lanes painted on the road, and then maybe on either side you've got big concrete berms like 3 feet high that you're not going to be able to drive through. Yet we can stay between those lines. And we don't think about the fact that we're like turning constantly in little teeny ways to stay between those lines. If our meditation was our driving, we would be constantly slamming into the walls, I think, these concrete walls, and wrecking the car and being upset that we wrecked the car. So I think that's actually a fairly good analogy for how we approach life and our practice and things like that. I mean, if we could just do it more like we drive, just make those little adjustments, keep it between the painted lines rather than slamming into the concrete, things would go a lot easier, So I want to leave a little time for questions. Thank you guys so much for letting me share all that. I'm happy to answer any kind of questions too, because I love talking about all this stuff.
When you met, when you were talking about the like kind of like a plate, is that throughout the day or just during your meditation? Is that
all the time?
Yeah, all the time, right? Okay, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think off the cushion, it's trickier because there's just so many other layers going on.
Right.
And I know I brought up earlier too, like gross impermanence being post in meditation and formal meditation. And I think the reason I brought that up because that's more of a continuum than we think too,
Right.
Like ideally we're blurring those lines and making, another interesting point that I learned recently is Karl Brunholz was talking about the word gom in Tibetan that we translate as meditation. And you may have heard before that the meaning of that is actually much closer to familiarize, to get to know. So that's an important point about translation, because we kind of take it to be this thing that we do, and we're in the West, and like meditation's kind of like a foreign idea in general. So we're like contriving some sort of state of meditation, but really it's just getting to know the way our experience works, like becoming fully familiar with the impermanence of our situation, of the fluctuations of that dynamic energy. But most fascinating, what I learned from Karl Brunholz the other day is he said that that word doesn't even have the connotation of anyone doing it. It's like something that just happens. And how different is that from our whole idea of like, I'm going to meditate now. How is my meditation going? Like it really points out how that's kind of off the mark,
What was the word again?
Tibetan word is that like we would write it like as like G-O-M, gom.
Yeah, gom. Okay.
Yeah. Just happens.
Actually, I wanted to ask something. Let me see if I can formulate it. I think we talk about experiencing impermanence, and I guess obviously that's what we do all the time. That's why we're trying to do stuff all the time to fix the impermanence, right? And for me, I think in my mind, I experience it as two parts. Like there is a Dharma mind where I feel comfortable to say it in that's the only way I can express it, where I have the trust in this is the place to fix something. But then when I'm in the normal world, so to speak, I suddenly feel like, oh, but I have to do X, Y, Z to put food on the table and to do this and that. And I think that's what it creates a really big conflict for me, that I still feel like I can't let completely go of everything, because I don't have, there's no whatever flux of money coming in and saying, okay, you stay here, I feed you, you just meditate and do whatever, and I think nobody has this experience anyways, but I was thinking even like, oh, so what would it be like if I ever had a chance to do a 3-year retreat? I think I'm feeling, even then I would think like, oh, but what happens after the 3 years? What am I going to do then? So I think that's I'm not saying it it's sort of, I feel like in myself, I have a deep trust and reliance on the Dharma, but I do feel like I'm getting kicked around a lot with that. And, like with all the things happening all the time, it may be little things or big things, but I always feel like, I don't know, like almost like there's a little man sitting on me here, but, in the real world, you have to do this, this and that, you have to take your job seriously. You have to do this, you have to be taking care of your family, you have to blah, 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 blah. So don't do too much of that Dharma stuff because you need to put food on the table,
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's not really a question, it's just maybe an observance, but that's, I think, what I experience. And I feel also like through practicing, it feels like this gets sort of almost louder in a way. The difference between the things, it becomes more there. But I don't feel like I'm stronger in a way to deal with it. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I mean, I think I totally understand, for sure. And I guess I think what I'm thinking as I hear you say that is, I think we all have a little bit of idealism that, we kind of want to be able to just live out our Dharma ideals in perfect accord with the situation. But we have these practical concerns, and we also have self-fixation, So I think I can completely relate. And I think I don't know if this is an answer, but I want to share that one of the most meaningful things I heard in the 3-year retreat was from Lama Yeshe Jamso, not the translator, but the German fellow. He actually was at KTD for a while. Suki, I don't know if you remember Philip, but so he said to me at one point in the retreat, this is a point where there's a lot of conflict going on, a very tense time in the retreat. And he said, I think a lot of times when people are experiencing a great deal of suffering, it's because they're clinging too much to either the materialism kind of view or the nihilism view. Like we're either clinging too much to things, everything really matters, or too much to like nothing matters. And usually when there's some kind of suffering coming up, you can kind of figure out which one of those it is. And I think we can also kind of figure out what kind of individual we are, like which one we tend towards. And that's a good thing to know, because at the end of the day, we've got to make our way in the world, and we also want to work our way towards enlightenment. But this Buddha nature, isn't separate anyway. And so there's all these techniques and ideas and concepts and stuff that can help us, and can also become a source of fixation as well. But I think that probably more often than not, we could give ourselves a little bit more slack than we think and just let ourselves react to a situation as it is, and so I think maybe that might help in those kind of situations is, if it feels like you're getting kind of stuck on some in one of those moments, just interact with it and let your Buddha nature kind of take care of it. Obviously, there's times when we need to regulate our behavior and do mantra or whatever technique we want to apply. But I think a lot of times, particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, because we've got so much stuff, and all the bells and whistles, like we always think like, well, I know all these techniques, which one do I need? Which on my tool belt fits this situation, and I think sometimes we can just be there, so that's kind of helped me. Does that help a little bit?
Definitely.
Yeah, good.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You talked about renunciation, and I'd like to hear a little bit about your experience after your 3-year retreat, how it was returning to, the normal day-to-day life, and how you noticed yourself responding to, maybe a different response than you had to many things in your life before and after the retreat.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that question, Daniel, because that actually like highlighted for me maybe even more of what Max was talking about. Because yeah, I mean, like, honestly, like the story of me coming back, I mean, for me has been entirely like, how do I make this work as a young Western Dharma teacher? And because I know, like, for instance, this week, like I'm doing so many things. And if I had another job, I couldn't do that. You know, like I recorded a podcast this afternoon. Yesterday, I was at this affiliate chaplains meeting. I had a meeting tonight about a grant that we received about funding the pastorate. I had Dharma student interviews. Tomorrow, I'm meeting with the library team. So I'm getting all these opportunities to engage with these teachings. And I know from playing music all these years that, like, the more you engage with this stuff, the more familiar it gets, the more easy it feels, you know, to do these things. And so I would love to do that all the time, but in any case, there's always practical things that need to be done. And I've definitely struggled with, like, how much of that can I do? How much of that should I do? I think that a lot of people, and I don't know if this is built into your question or not, but a lot of people have said to me things like, I can't imagine coming out of a 3-year retreat at the time that you did, which was March of 2020, you know? And I ended up coming home to Columbus right during the George Floyd protests. So, like, I'm downtown, and I had to come through National Guard blockades just to get to the apartment where I'm living. And there were 3 choppers circling above the city. It was pretty surreal time to come home, but honestly, like, all of that was relatively easy, and actually felt, I mean, I think because of the blessings of the lineage and all the practice and all that stuff. I mean, there was a split second when I got home where I thought, I probably should go back. But I immediately thought, no, I'm home just in time. Like, this is what I was there for. And now I can actually apply this in my community. And so that was the only time, it was just a blink of, like, I want out of this. And then it was like, no, let's do this for real now. So there's not a lot that I gave up compared to before retreat. I'm not a monk, so I still enjoy craft beer. I still enjoy music and concerts and stuff, and but because of the ability to share these teachings and my wanting to do that as authentically as possible for me in my unenlightened state, it's been easy to kind of organize things in a way that I think support doing this kind of work. And it hasn't been hard. And that's what I found. You all may have noticed this too. If you have a bad habit, it's much easier to just increase your Dharma practice than it is to try to, like, stop the bad habit, because those bad habits will kind of just fall off as your practice progresses. And so that's kind of a nice thing about renunciation, is like you can actively practice it, but you probably have to do it in a balanced way, you know, or else, like we talked about, like, if you try to just cut something out altogether, it's probably going to swing back at some point. So renunciation should always have a little bit of balance to it. But there's also that other aspect of just starting good habits also kind of brings about a natural renunciation.
Okay. Great. And by the way, I did notice there's a beer called Samsara.
Oh, that's good, because there's another one called Nirvana.
You got to mix the.
Yeah. That's funny. Yeah, Nirvana I had Nirvana. That was the last beer I had before I went into retreat, and the last one before I got out.
Funny. That's great. Do you have a podcast as well?
Yeah. It's honestly, like, the best thing. I mean, I love KTC, and that's really, I guess, the best thing. But the best thing for me and Lama Mitchell, because Lama Mitchell is down in Mississippi. He's about 12 years younger than me, but we are both big fans of the band Fish. And Fish, I've been listening to them for like 25 years, and it's the most, like, improvisational, open, warm community. I mean, there's just so much about it that Mitchell and I both realized in retreat prepared us for this. Like, we both had the feeling that, like, not like the band did that, but the circumstances were such that it was really great preparation,
Wow.
you know, for Dharma. I think mainly because like they don't like play the same songs. The songs aren't the same every time. You have to kind of just give up every bit of attachment to engage with it. And so we always ended up kind of talking in fish language because we knew fish stuff and we knew Dharma. And so that was where the idea of the podcast came, is like, let's talk about Dharma using fish. And then that way we can maybe get fish heads into Dharma. And maybe there's some
Okay.
Dharma people that might like fish too. And in any case,
Okay.
we can be us, you know, we can actually like be who we are and teach from that perspective. And it's been really great for he and I to be able to explore the teachings in that way, you know?
Yeah. What's the name?
It's called Lama to Boot, which is a fish reference. I'll put it in the chat.
Okay. Oh, cool.
There's a fish song called the chorus is Lama to boot, but it's a double L Lama.
Okay.
But,
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Lama to boot. Okay.
Yeah.
Is fish kind of like the Grateful Dead a little bit?
There's definitely some overlap. Yeah. I mean, I think that definitely in like the format of like 2-hour shows and, you know, 2-set shows, and they travel around and people follow them because you never know what you're going to see, and a lot of experimentation. Yeah. There's some overlap.
Sometimes, because I was a Deadhead growing up, you know, followed them all over the place in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And now I always look like I used to follow the Dead, but now I'm kind of following the Dharma. You know, it's like, oh, so be here, let's go. It's like a Dead show, but it's
Yes.
the Dharma of the Dead.
And Jody, you may have found too, like one thing when I used to play music a lot, when I stopped playing music was when I started practicing Dharma, because I realized that the happiness that I was getting in big dramatic spurts from playing a show, and then I would kind of crash from that afterwards. Like I remember being sad driving home from shows, you know, I wanted that to go on forever. Once I started practicing meditation, I realized that like I was accessing that same happiness, but in a stable way, you know, and I don't play very much anymore at all, but I don't feel like I'm missing anything.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Someday you'll feel like that about beer.
Yeah, it's quite possible. Yep.
That is.
Well, we're too young to think about that. Some of these older Dharma students, you know what I'm saying? You had
That's
years
really cool.
for us drinking beers and partying in the 60s and hanging out at Haight-Ashbury and stuff.
Yeah.
That's neat. I bet we have some similar stories, Jody.
I got some great Grateful Dead stories, like amazing ones, and then great Dharma stories too.
Yeah. I'll tell one quick fish story because this is really, I thought was super meaningful. I did a whole summer tour in 97. It was 19 shows. I went all around the country. And at the last 3 shows were a festival. And they always have like it's just them at their festivals. And they have like a community square area where there's like arts and crafts and all kinds of like installations. And they had this thing where everybody could paint these like pieces of wood. They were just big pieces of wood and paints around. And so it was a 2-day festival. And so they just started building this sculpture to the side of the concert field with all of the pieces of painted wood that everyone in the audience had painted. So just like always, it always felt and feels like a collaboration between the band and the audience and the energy. And we all kind of build this thing together. And they actually were visually making a piece of art out that together at this show. Like that's not a common thing, but they did it at this show where we all built this one sculpture together. And then on the last night, the band members painted pieces of art on stage, and they actually handed those pieces to the audience, and the audience kind of walked them over to the art thing, and they hung it up, and it was really cool. And then at the end of the show, there was a giant match that came up and burned the whole thing to the ground. And I remember, like, to me, to this day, like one of the best Dharma lessons I've ever learned, and completely apropos of our conversation today too, you know, because it was kind of shocking for people to see that thing burn down. But boy, what a way to kind of get a point across, you know?
Kind of like the sand mandalas they do, like all those fine mandalas, and they just
Yeah.
gone.
Yeah. And I'm sure there's always people that are like shocked and upset that they wiped that whole mandala away, you know. But
Yeah.
and there were people that were upset they were burning it down, took it as sort of like an insult, you know. But in my proto-Buddhist days, that I got some message from that, you know.
Awesome.
Good story.
Yeah. Anyone else? Thank you guys so much. Oh yeah, go ahead. It's okay.
Well, I just want to say, just wanted to say how inspiring this is, and really fun too. And just right on, just totally great. I'm on the East Coast time, so this is way past my bedtime. So I'm kind of brain dead, but it's just been great.
Oh,
Thanks.
thank you.
Agreed.
Yeah, thank you
Agreed.
guys so much. I
Yeah,
mean, I have to
thank
say,
you.
This is great.
I am nervous, and I've been nervous. I mean, I'm barely getting comfortable. Like public speaking is kind of a new thing for me. So I appreciate you guys having me and being patient with me. And I really mean it. Like, I know a lot of you have been practicing for a long time, you know, so thank you from the bottom of my heart for that, and because it is through our practice and our support of this stuff that the Dharma even stays around.
Mhm.
So it's really wonderful that we're all doing this, and I'm so glad we've been on this path together, but I'm so glad to know you guys now.
Thank you.
Great.
I just want to say one thing really quick too.
Do you want to dedication of merit?
Oh, really?
Yes, yeah, that would be wonderful. Yeah,
Good idea.
let's do that.
And
So
come back
by
soon.
oh, I would love to. How about next month?
Yes, yeah. That'll work.
Cool. By this merit, may we obtain the omniscience of Buddhahood and defeat our common enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may we free all beings. May we free all beings. May we free all beings. Thank you, new
Thank you.
friends.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Lama.
Thank you. That was
I will be back
you.
next month, so I'll see you guys.
Good.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank
Yippee.
you.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Praying for the
Take care.
Ukraine.
Yes.
Maxwell,
Yes, Chris.